Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our Registrar's Cosmetic webinar, Do Not Become EU Non-Compliant, Understanding the 51st Amendment of IFRA Standards with Enforcement, if you can guess it, tomorrow. So really important, that we redid this webinar. We had a ton of questions last time, and hopefully they all got answered for everyone. But we really wanted to take this time again to reinforce how important it is to begin to review your formulas if you haven't already. And then also, following this regulation through with new formulations as well. So a little bit about me, if you've joined us before, I've been in the cosmetic industry for over 15 years. I had, my share of the private sector, contract manufacturing, and then specializing in formulations and regulatory. Love this community, love this industry. It is one of a kind, and we are all so lucky to be in it, is what I say to myself every single day when I get up and come to work. So today we want to talk about a little bit of our how PCR and registrar are joined together. So wanted to definitely introduce a new addition to Registrar Corp, the Personal Care Regulatory, which became a part of Registrar back in December of 2024. Together, Registrar and PCR combine the teams with experienced toxicologists and regulatory specialists, and they provide seamless end-to-end compliance services across the UK, EU, and US. PCR is a leading cosmetic regulatory toxicology and compliance company that is based both in the United Kingdom and Ireland. And just such a great team to work with. They are so talented, answer all your questions. So I really highly recommend, if you're looking for a really strong partner, to come to the Registrar and PCR team. In this webinar, we're going to review everything regarding IFRA Standards, the 51st Amendment. And then we'll also include some details how Registrar and PCR can help you become compliant. So today, again, we're going to go through who is IFRA, what are IFRA standards, how are IFRA standards regulated, who must comply with IFRA standards, the IFRA 51st Amendment timeline, key provisions of this new amendment, impact and challenges, and enforcement in the EU, and then how we can help get your products compliant. Would like to say, if you guys do have any questions, definitely drop them in the questions box, and at the end we will get to them. And anything that's not answered throughout this webinar, we will make sure to follow up with you afterwards. I'll give you all the contact information at the end. So who is IFRA? So IFRA is the International Fragrance Association. It's a global representation body for the fragrance industry. It was established in 1973 to ensure the safety and sustainability of fragrance materials used in various products. So again, IFRA helps develop safety guidelines, compliance and regulations, and advocacy as well. So in terms of safety guidelines, IFRA develops and updates standards to regulate the use of fragrance ingredients based on scientific research and risk assessments. Its guidelines aim to protect consumers from potential irritants or allergens that certain fragrances may cause, right? So if you ever see an IFRA report, you'll see much of the thought that goes behind developing these safety guidelines. In terms of compliance and regulation, the association monitors and enforces compliance among its members, ensuring that all fragrance formulations meet the agreed upon safety standards, right? So if you ever see the different categories and then you see the different levels and percentages that can be used, like for instance, a lipstick or a lip gloss, and you see the fragrance can only be used at 2%, right? This comes from an evaluation of the overall fragrance, its risk assessment when being used on the lips, and then also being used in a lip product, right? So that's how the thought process comes from IFRA. And then lastly, advocacy. So IFRA acts as a collective voice for the fragrance industry, representing its interests to regulatory authorities and fostering the best practices among its members to enhance product safety and quality, right? So this is also to protect the fragrance houses. And I say that because when we don't have these types of safety guidelines or compliance or regulations in place, there could be potential for irritants or allergens to cause, adverse events in its users, and potentially can cause a much bigger issue in the fragrance industry versus not having any guidelines at all, right? A lot of, what I've seen more recently, especially in the fragrance, and I'm going to say fragrance throughout here, but no, when I say fragrance, I mean fragrance and flavors and any types of irritants or allergens, is that when they're not, studied, or there isn't a solid review of those types of fragrance and flavors, is where we see a lot of issues. And potentially, what happens, of course, with social media and the news, is something can get a very bad overall opinion of it by just not being used properly. So this is why these safety and guidelines and compliance are so important, and that the IFRA body helps establish these guidelines. So what are the IFRA standards? And I'm going to say globally. I know we're talking specifically about EU right now, but this is globally recognized, right? So it's not just EU, it's the UK, it's the US, it's Canada, it's everyone who understands how important the safety guidelines and standards are established by IFRA. So it is globally recognized risk management system for the safe use of fragrance ingredients. It provides safety criteria for fragrance materials. It is based on scientific knowledge and testing. And it focuses on ingredients that may pose potential health risks or cause adverse reactions in consumers. So just as I said before, this is really to protect both the consumer and both the fragrance supplier from potentially causing a health risk or an adverse reaction. I think we've seen more than ever in the last, I would say, 5 years, how much fragrances can have an effect on our bodies. And this goes not just for cosmetic products, right? Any fragrance, candles or diffusers or anything of that nature, right? The potential health risks that they could really cause. And it's important to understand how IFRA recognizes all of these potential issues and goes through them and standardizes this practice, right? So standardizing restriction by quantitative limits on use of fragrance ingredients. So as I said before, if you're in a certain category, the percentage that you are allowed to use, prohibiting certain fragrance allergens as well. And I think that's a really important piece to mention here, is that when something is prohibited, it's because there is enough scientific information and data and adverse reactions around it for them to prohibit something. And we see that as we develop new materials or go back to older materials and see that the potential risk is higher than the potential use. And then the specification on the use of the fragrance ingredients, such as purity requirements. This has been, I think, a huge shift, I would say more recently, in the purity requirements. Anytime that we're handling EU, registrations, it's always, can we have a purity statement? And it's really important to understand that the purity statement helps establish, right, if there is any incidentals, is there any impurities, is there things that we don't know about this fragrance that we need to know about. Again, there is so much proprietary information, I think, around fragrances. If you have that top fragrance, you're not sharing that with anybody. But we really do have to dig a little bit deeper into the fragrances, what they're made of, and their overall purity level. The best example I can say, again, as we get into, the regulations, is, we do this with our colorants, right? How pure are our colorants, right? Because we want to make sure that we're getting the best possible version of that material to our consumers. So many are probably like, well, no one's going to knock on my door that I violated IFRA. But unfortunately, IFRA is regulated, and IFRA self-regulates the safe use of fragrance and ingredients. And a lot of the times when you're working with responsible persons like PCR, right, we will review that IFRA statement, right? And we will review the percentage that's used in your particular product. It is very, very important that you have an expert that understands IFRA and is able to help you through this process. You know, more recently or not, I've just seen so many brands by default, right? You know, you want it to taste good, and it tastes so good when you have a higher flavor, right? And then you realize you're over the IFRA limit, right? And you have to go back and reformulate. So it's really good if you're working with a flavor or a fragrance to request these IFRA documents and to understand the levels that you are going to have to abide by. Again, it evaluates the Research Institute for Fragrance Materials, also known as RIFM, safety assessments, and they're the institute that reviews all of the safety assessments of the fragrances. So this isn't just coming from, well, we don't want you to use this, you know, flavor or fragrance at 5%, right? This is real research that goes into the safety of each individual fragrance or flavor ingredient that's used in, more specifically, cosmetic products, but also other products as well. A lot of, you know, what I've been hearing too is that these safety assessments are being used globally to establish a lot of the EU allergens and a lot of the UK allergens and Canada allergens, and even eventually the US allergens, because these safety assessments are so thorough and really go into how this fragrance could potentially be used and potentially cause a problem. They also have an independent expert panel, and this is members of the fragrance industry that have a really deep knowledge of fragrance development, fragrance materials, and this goes both synthetic and natural. So don't think this is just a path down synthetic ingredients being evaluated. It's everything, right? And this independent expert panel assesses, right, where we are in a fragrance development or in a fragrance safety assessment, and has that expertise to also communicate some, you know, individual parts into developing IFRA standards. Also, member companies, this is very important to understand that there are fragrance houses that are part of IFRA, that support IFRA, that want, you know, the evaluation to happen so that they can also be protected, right? It also consists of multi-stakeholder standard setting process as well. We'll get into that a little bit deeper. There's over 263 standards for safe use of fragrance ingredients. So really, really important to understand that this is an ongoing process. So whenever we see like an update to IFRA, like the, you know, eventually we'll see the 81st, you know, update. This is an ever evolving type of research. It just does not stop here. So it might feel like we just went through the IFRA 50th amendment, but it is a process that is very important to understand. And again, you know, when going through a standard setting process, such as, you know, the newer one, the changes that, you know, are sometimes made are not that great, or sometimes they're huge changes. We're going to go through those individually a little bit later. But it's important to understand that when the IFRA sets a new standard in process, they want to have all of the information ready, right? They don't want to not have everyone be prepared to understand what the changes are going to be and when they must comply by those changes. So IFRA sends information to RIFM, right, the Research Institute. The Research Institute prepares a dossier, right? So this is toxicologists. These are regulatory bodies, specialists in fragrance research and fragrance evaluation to prepare a dossier, right? And anything that they discover through that, and we don't see all of that, right? We don't see if there is something that they're evaluating and it doesn't make it to the new standard process because they didn't feel it needed an additional step or additional, you know, restriction. But they prepare a dossier on things that they think need to be changed or reset in the standard. And again, these are scientists, these are people that understand the fragrance development and understand the irritants and the allergens and how those safety guidelines need to be addressed in the compliance and regulation pieces of the standard. Next step is expert panel evaluates. So as I said before, these are experts that are outside of the research institute. And it's really important that that distinction is made, because it doesn't just come from one place, right? The Research Institute provides all their safety assessments. They have the dossier ready, but the expert panel evaluates them, right? And again, they can agree, not agree. It is you know, depending on what the changes could possibly be made. It could be a short process, long process. But once everything is evaluated and agreed upon, IFRA prepares a standard. And this is you know, for instance, the IFRA 51st standard. And then they have a consulting phase, right? And they consult with member companies, they consult with other bodies to really have a like a together standard that everybody feels is the next IFRA standard to be put in place. And then lastly, they do the publications and implementation. So who must comply with IFRA standards? So all fragrance consumer products are in the scope of IFRA standards, covered in our IFM safety assessment. This, you know, specifically, we're going to talk about cosmetics and OTC products, but this includes leave-on and rinse-off products as well. So this is, of course, including some products, fragrance, makeup, baby creams, oils, personal care items like your shampoos, your conditioners, oral care products, and then OTC products that are regulated as cosmetics. Just to note, there are other scopes of what's included with IFRA standards. So shaving balms and shaving creams. There is a whole list on the IFRA website what products are included inside the IFRA standards. You can go and read it, but I'm going to tell you, if it has a fragrance or a flavor in it, you are going to need to comply with IFRA standards. Everyone, you know, is that I've talked to more recently definitely has felt that the deadline came very, very fast, probably faster than everyone assumed that it was going to come up. And if, you know, I always like to give a timeline, because it just goes to show that this isn't an overnight process. It's not an overnight thing, especially if you have a product that is, you know, was compliant during the 50th amendment and now is suddenly not compliant in the 51st, right? You need that time to update your formulations, to review. So the notification of the 51st Amendment to IFRA standards was published on the 30th of June, 2023. The implementation timeline for new and existing creations is what you see right here. And it applies to the new restrictions and the restrictions specification standards. So again, all briefs submitted before January 30th, 2024 are classified as existing creations. All briefs submitted after January 3rd, 2024 are classified as new creations. And again, you'll see through this timeline, right? So from June 30th, 2023, then to October 30th, 2023, they were still evaluating the impact of the 51st Amendment on fragrance mixtures to share the relevant information with consumers. But as of that January 30th, 2024 date, right, that's considered new creations. March 30th, 2024, entry into force new creations. So this was 9 months from the notification date. So understanding how they implement, right, the new, and I'm saying creations because this is how they word it, but they're new formulations versus the existing formulations. Now, tomorrow, the October 30th, 2025 date, is everything that was existing should be compliant. So you get 28 months from the notification date to comply with this new IFRA 51st standard. I do know that when it went into the notification date and everything was handed over and exchanged, right, that everyone did a mass review of the notification updates, the standard updates, and went back to their formulas to see which one was, you know, if any of the formulas were not compliant, right? And more, you know, specifically, this amendment includes one new prohibited standard, And it was important for everyone to understand these dates and understand that if they had a prohibited item, that they would need to reformulate. Again, these dates apply to the supply of the fragrance mixtures, like in the fragrance mixtures, and then in the formula as well. So it's important to understand the difference between a fragrance mixture and final formula. They have different standards to comply with. So everyone has an understanding of the timeline and what we're looking at, which in all honesty, I do think that a lot of the regulations we've been seeing lately, especially around the fragrance and flavors, have given a very generous timeline. So I think that is a very generous for existing, and then for new creations, right? If you have the regulation, you might as well follow the regulation while you have it. So key provisions of IFRA's 51st Amendment, updated guidance document for the use of the IFRA standards. So always check the guidance documents. They're kind of the best way to get a crash course on IFRA, and especially the changes that are made. Specifically for this one, 32 restriction standards based on skin sensitization and systematic toxicity, 11 restriction standards based on dermal sensitization, 2 restriction standards based on systematic toxicity, 1 restriction standard based on depigmenting potential, 1 restriction specification standard based on dermal sensitization and systematic toxicity, 1 prohibited standard due to potential gene toxicity effects, and then updates to the IFRA categories. Again, the IFRA categories, I think, is a huge one. And I'm going to say, I'll briefly say it here, and then if we have any other questions, we can kind of talk through a little bit later on the categories. But the categories are really how you place your specific product. So for instance, category 4, right? The change aftershaves of all types have been amended to exclude creams and balms, which now are assigned to category B, right? So if you were in category B5, sorry, I apologize. So if you were originally in category 4 as an aftershave, but you were an aftershave cream or balm, you are now assigned to category B, right? So category B now, beard and mustache care have been added to facial moisturizers and cream. And I think, you know, understanding those changes is a huge impact. Sorry, let me go back real quick, is a huge impact of how you classify your products currently, and then how the new category is going to reflect on your product. And that new category now needs to be updated on your end and checked on your end. Another update was category 8 now includes intimate deodorant spray. Category 10A now includes manually applied dried cleaning kits. Category 11B includes pillow spray. Category 12, and again, this is not so much on cosmetic, but category 12 includes dryer fabric conditioner sheets and dry cleaning sheets. So you can see those category changes can really affect the way that you have to go back and look at the percentages in your formulation as they sit right now. So also relevant changes to the guidance document for IFRA standards. The guidance changes, like I said, is like a really good place to start if you're new to IFRA or you're new to understanding the 51st Amendment of IFRA. So definitely take a look at the guidance document. But I did a quick little cheat sheet here for you guys, so you can see what are the relevant changes. There are also additional changes outside of this, but this is you know, what I felt was the most relevant of the changes. So for one, clarification about paper products. There's more clear wording on how to apply the IFRA standards for paper products when calculating fragrance, ingredients, concentrations, and finished products. So the reason I have this up here is because, again, this can include, you know, we think about fabric, softener sheets, dry sheets, paper, other paper products. I put this up here because we have a lot of blotting papers out there. We have a lot of new technology and makeup on papers, right? So understanding how that fragrance calculation works in that specific category. Clarification category of dryer sheets and all of that may not be the best place for right here, but I think it was important to understand because it did say paper products. Categorization of pillow spray, right? The placing of pillow spray in category 11B is based on skin sensitization. Concerns and potential transfer of the product from the pillow to the skin, right? We're all into this wellness and this health area, and there's tons and tons of makeup companies and cosmetic companies that are supplying pillow sprays and things of that nature, right, to help you go to sleep, to reduce your stress. So very, very important to understand if there is a change in your category, and this is one of your categories that you handle, that you have to go back and check. Handling of traces. The Research Institute felt that the current the current text is adequate regarding describing the rules and responsibilities, exchanging that information, but there isn't a proper supply chain of exchanging that information of traces to the finished consumer product, right? So the Research Institute felt the fragrance houses did a very good job of understanding the roles and responsibilities of exchanging information with them, but they felt that a lot of that got lost when they are distributing that fragrance material to a different supplier. So they reworded that to have a better responsible management of the traces in a finished consumer product as well. And that's what you're going to be seeing a lot lately is updates to certain documents. I just got hit with one 2 weeks ago out of nowhere, an update of the traces in a fragrance material that was being used that was never captured on the original fragrance, right? So things of that nature are definitely important to understand if you have those updates made. And even if you have fragrance and flavors, right, going back and understanding if there was any update on traces and confirmation of traces on the paperwork side, right? It's not like they just came out of nowhere. You know, these new traces of materials or impurities or residuals, but it's important to go back and make sure that you have the most updated doc. Phototoxicity considerations for products in category 6. So the expert panel for fragrance safety concluded that the products in category 6 can be considered rinse off with regard to phototoxicity. And that's really important, right? If you are in any type of category 6 where you need to understand that. Elimination of sunblock terminology in the guidance. The term sunblock is replaced with the term UV filters instead. Again, very important to understand the terminology that's working through here, especially if you have an OTC that is a cosmetic. Clarification that makeup remover for face and eyes also includes potential exposure to lips. Okay, this was a huge one for me, and I think that was, you know, a little surprising, but when you really do think about it, you are washing your face and you are exposing your makeup remover for your face and your eyes to the lips. So these products are considered to have exposure conditions comparable to products designed for the lips that must follow their requirements for category 1. A makeup remover also suitable for lips is considered similar to makeup remover marketed for face and therefore does not always fall under the requirement to be a product that is used by the eyes as well. So a lot of what I've seen, especially for this particular clarification, was the exposure to the lips when you have a full face, you know, makeup remover or a makeup wash. So definitely the potential exposure was a surprise. So if you do have any cleansers or things of that nature with flavor or with fragrances in them, definitely go back and recheck your levels. And then clarification about aftershaves of all types in category 4. This new descriptor in the guidance document is aftershaves of all types except those creams and balms. So some aftershaves are creams and lotion products and may be categorized as a face moisturizer in category B. So again, recategorizing these types of products specifically needs to have a check back to those levels in your original IFRA 51st document. And by the way, all documents from fragrance houses should be updated at this point. You should not be receiving any more IFRA 50th Amendment documents. Everything should be updated. More importantly, I think, and again, this is coming at a very similar time as everyone's talking about allergens, and it's a lot to take on from a flavor and fragrance perspective, but it's almost kind of working for your benefit as well, because as you're going back and you are looking at your IFRA 51st Amendments, changes in categories, you can also redo your allergen updates and your allergen requirements, because I think that's definitely can go hand in hand, especially if you're dealing with a specific fragrance house, or if you're working with a specific fragrance across your beauty lines. It's actually happening at a really good time. So impact and challenges of the IFRA 51st Amendment. Most limits included within the revised standards are more restricted. I don't think that's a surprise for anyone. Most limits included within the revised standards are more restricted than before, with few exceptions. For example, some limits have increased due to additional safety information, but most of them have become more restricted. And I don't think that's a surprise for anyone. That's, I think going to be the course of fragrance and flavors moving forward. 48 new standards and 12 revised standards have implications for any fragrance ingredients and formulations that you create or used in a finished product. So given that there are 48 new standards and 12 revised standards, it's essential to review each of these standards and determine if they may have an implication for any fragrance ingredients and formulations that you create or use in your finished products. The standards are freely available to members and non-members on the IFRA website. So definitely take a look at those and work with your regulatory teams, or come work with us and we can help you through all of these new and revised standards to understand if they impact you, and there has to be any changes made. Natural complex substances have new lower limits. I have seen this natural craze for a while now. I don't think it's going away. Everybody wants to have a more natural flavor or natural fragrance. People make these claims left and right because, you think natural, you think clean. And that's not always typically the case. There has been a lot of, review of safety of certain natural substances that actually cause more irritation and more allergic reactions than synthetic products. And the way that I always think about this, right, is if you have an allergy to food, right, and you're using basil, right, and you're allergic to basil, and basil's used in a flavor, right, you could have a reaction to that natural ingredient. And I use basil for that reason, because particularly the use of basil, tarragon, and nutmeg will be affected by these new lower limits. And as you can see, those are very commonly used in the cosmetic industry. Nutmeg is, I think, everywhere during the holiday season and holiday kits. And basil, I've been seeing more in hair products, but I'm sure it will make its way to, some other face products and even lip products. So those natural complex substances, right, that we thought were always so safe and they had, less impact, toxicity on your body, the safety standards have to be established for those. Particularly because it's natural and people could have reactions and irritation to those. Phototoxicity now applies to all rinse-off products. That was not before. So it's important to understand that is now for rinse-offs and not just leave-ons. IFRA also had relevant updates within existing categories. And again, I won't bore you with the details, but there's 2 new CAS numbers that are included for farnesol, There's 2 other minor updates, existing standards that have to do specifically with farnesyl. And again, the implementation timeline associated with the 51st Amendment, you know, is important to understand that everybody has already done this, right? It started in 2023 and now has moved into 2025. So again, you need to really understand the due date tomorrow has been 2 years coming. And again, more importantly, I think the category changes are the hugest changes, and that will affect everyone, I think, at a higher level, especially, you know, understanding those changes and that those limits might have been reduced, right? Because now you need to have that new category. And then additionally, I think that the new standards, right, is something that everyone needs to review to make sure that you are compliant. So let's talk a little bit about enforcement in the EU. Again, a safety assessment protocol is really important, and you need to have someone who understands IFRA. As I've mentioned throughout the call, our PCR team is absolutely amazing. Safety assessors will request that the product is IFRA compliant, right? The safety assessments will need to be updated to reflect new clarifications, limits, and restrictions. Not many people know this, but when you do this update to new clarifications, limits, and restrictions, this can trigger a new CPSR and label. When a CPSR and label update are made, it requires a PIF update and an update to the notification. So when I say if you have not checked yet, you definitely need help doing this, please come to us and we can help walk through it and help you get through a new safety assessment, a new CPSR, potentially a new label, PIF update, and update to the notification. All responsible persons in the EU need to have that PIF on, you know, that PIF in their hand, and it has to be accurate. Numerous ingredients, you know, in our formulations are known to cause allergies or sensitivities and are frequently found in fragrance blends. And again, sensitive people may experience skin reactions even at low concentrations. So when, you know, during the CPSR for the fragrance review, right, and fragrance review, flavor review, right, the safety assessor has to consider the possible interactions between the substances in addition to evaluating each one separately, right? And with this new IFRA update, right, and as we just talked before, there's 48 new standards, there's lower limits, there's category changes, there is lower, you know, reduced verbiage that is changed, right? You really do need someone who is trained to understand those changes and how those changes affect your formulation and your current product and how it's marketed, right? So some of those category changes, you fall in a different category in a different market. And that is where, you know, a safety assessor needs to have that update. EU ensures that IFRA standards are followed. Again, the EU regulatory bodies are very strict. I don't think I have to tell anyone that's on this phone call how strict they are. They follow multiple, you know, ways to protect the EU from, you know, non-compliance with these standards. I want to also mention at a retail level, right? If you are in retailers, especially the big box retailers like your Sephora's, your, you know, your Boots, your Ultas, right? They also require, you know, for these regulations to be followed as well, especially if you're holding their clean badges, if you're holding any type of sustainability or product awareness. Many of you that probably have already went through this experience having to hand over IFRA standards or IFRA paperwork because it is important. You know, non-compliant products can be refused entry. It could be a product market ban or product destruction, right? So imagine delivering your entire, you know, SKU line at a, you know, and realizing you're not compliant with IFRA and the product being destroyed, right? Also, a CPMP notification failure can endure fines as well. So for instance, if you did not update your CPSR or your label or your PIF update or the notification, you can have fines. And I've been seeing some of the fines that are going around in Europe right now, and it is extraordinary how many people are paying fines into being non-compliant. And then again, penalties for products with non-compliant PIFs. So again, just to reiterate, if you do not update to the new IFRA 51st Amendment, right, you do not go through this safety assessment protocol to adhere, you are not compliant, right? And your PIF is not compliant, and this can endure penalties. You know, a lot of what our safety assessors do is try to also understand, you know, how fast and quickly, you know, this can get done, because if you haven't started yet, right, you're a little bit behind the curve, right? And we don't know, you know, you might be getting away with it for now, but that might not be the case when we are reflecting back on all of the changes that EU is making, specifically around fragrances, right? This is a high priority for them. They want to be able to protect the consumer. And again, fragrances are subject to such a greater scrutiny. It is the, you know, once you see fragrance on that label, I think that it just triggers everyone to make sure that you are compliant with the IFRA regulations, with EU regulations, and again, if you are in any retailers, the regulations that they have as well. Again, I know this is a lot of information, not trying to scare anybody. We're just here to help, and we just want to make sure that we provide you with all the information possible. So again, how can we get your products compliant? For the changes with IFRA, we are making our clients aware that the CPSRs and labeling potentially need to be updated for the increased or decreased, I'm sorry, decreased limits, also all the new standards, and this includes, right, and they go into depth too, right, like they go into any essential oils, fragrances and flavors that are within that acceptable limit for the classification of your product against the updated IFRA 51st certificate. And again, as part of this, the updating the CPSRs, they're reviewing the labels again, mostly to confirm the INCI list and to re-notify the products. If clients have not created the CPSR with PCR, we're requesting updated PIFs to include all of the declarations in the 51st Amendment as well. So there's definitely ways that, you know, PCR can help. So there were, like I said, the review of the CPSR, the label updates, the product information file update, required product re-notifications, review of the product's use per category updates, and then review of the ingredients, limits, and restrictions. This is not for the faint of heart. It is very complicated, especially if you don't have a full understanding of the category or the new standards. So if you are already having your you know, PIF and notification done with somebody else, we can also take that on and help you get through some of those additional questions. And again, the date is tomorrow, so hopefully many of you on this call have at least had a review of IFRA standards, had a review of the 51st Amendment. But if not, or if you're just getting started too, this is a great place to get started, especially if you're going to move into a category that has a flavor or has a fragrance. This is a great place to start, and we can help you, obviously, with all of this that you see here on the slide right here. And I would love to answer some questions. So again, if you guys had any questions, I hope they got dropped in the box, and let's start with them. And then again, everyone's going to receive a recording of this as well. And if there's any questions that we can't get through or answered, please contact John. He is just the best sales in cosmetics and can answer all of your questions if you have any. But let's get some of your questions answered today. For Europe and US, is there anything written in the regulations making IFRA compliance mandatory for finished cosmetic products, or is it only mandatory for fragrance mixtures? So in the regulation, as a raw material, yeah. So basically in the IFRA standards, the standards will go through the fragrance materials, right? So when you ever look at one of the safety assessments from the Research Institute, right, it will be specific to the fragrance material, right? So in the IFRA document, it will tell you all the safety guidelines, the limits, the standards, everything of that nature. From there, the IFRA 51st statement will then breaks out the categories and then the percentage of use of that fragrance material in the finished product. So when you look at an IFRA 51st statement, you will see category 1 and a percentage, category 2 and a percentage, category B5 and a percentage, right? So the IFRA compliance is specific to both. The safety assessment is specific to the fragrance material itself. So like before, I brought up basil, right? So basil technically would be the fragrance, you know, basil with something else would be the fragrance mixture. Once that's placed into a formulation, that also has a restriction on it. So that's kind of how it's built. I hope that answered your question. There's definitely a lot of confusion, especially if you go through the standards and there's long, complicated fragrance mixture terminology. It can be a little bit confusing to understand, well, how does this directly affect the fragrance or flavor that I'm using? So specifically, the fragrance mixture will have its safety assessment, its limits, then used in a flavor or fragrance that has its limit in its specific category. I know the seminar is about EU IFRA regulation, but do you have any insight when the US FDA will start to require fragrance allergens to be listed on product IL, or when allergen listing will be available? So lots, you know, I love the allergen questions with the IFRA questions because I think it's so heavily related. Even though there are different types of ways to handle fragrances and flavors, specifically handle allergens versus handling fragrance and flavor mixtures and the safety. I don't have a date. I know that they are docketed to speak about it, but with the current state, you know, we might see something next year. You know, what we've been recommending is to strongly follow the EU allergens list, the extended allergen list, right? And you kind of really do cover all your bases. I don't see FDA, you know, creating its own list when there's so much information and safety testing from the extended allergens list that the EU just released as well. I mean, there has been so much testing that has went into this to develop this list. So I can't answer that, but I will say, you know, it could be very close or similar to. Now, whether they take the full extended list or the original 26 list, not sure. But as we've already seen, California has already made it mandatory to report all of the extended allergens in the EU. Canada is also following suit. It's with the extended allergen list. There's a lot of information around this and a lot of testing that went into this. So again, I hear you. I wish I had an answer, but I would stay closely to one of those allergens list if that's helpful. Does the 51st Amendment apply to anything that has an odor? Like, seems that they are not using a fragrance or flavor, but has essential oils, extracts, ingredients with the direct addition. Are those unfragranced or unflavored? I'm not sure I 100% get this question, but I think you're asking if it applies to something that's not a flavor but gives off a flavor or a fragrance. Anything that falls in the category of like a fragrant or a flavor, I would consider under the 51st Amendment, especially essential oils. And I say that because it might not directly be, you know, in your particular product as a fragrance or flavor, but there is definitely safety assessments done on essential oils or extracts, right? Like how I just said about tarragon, basil, right? That aren't technically, quote unquote, flavor or fragrance specifically, but then have implications through these standards because they are fragrant. And I think that's a really important distinction. I would always ask for especially essential oils for an IFRA statement. Always ask for extracts. I think this is more aligned with how the safety assessor will also evaluate. Again, I'm not a safety assessor, so this is probably a little bit more down their line, but it will be how the safety assessor looks at that particular ingredient. And I will tell you, with our safety assessors, right, they know if something will get flagged in that regard as well, right? So if you are using basil, right, but it's not as your fragrance, right, they might recommend to you, right, to say, basil is under this like umbrella of IFRA, and it definitely will give you exposure. So we should check it in the way, even though it's not directly a fragrance or flavor. So I think that's a really, really, really great question. And I think it's a really good way to understand. So what is the relevance, or how does it apply to compliance from the US and Canadian regulatory perspectives, given that this is a regulation enforced within the EU? Very good question. So in the beginning of the presentation, I said globally, right? Where this is really enforced in the EU, it is a globally accepted practice. There isn't specific US bodies that, are going to ask for your IFRA statements. I will tell you, retailers do ask for IFRA statements, especially under some of their clean badges or their quote unquote clean status. And this is specifically mentioned in there, right? You have to be under a certain level and you have to be within the IFRA category. And this is across a lot of retailers as well. Canadian regulatory perspective, it is, especially if you're working with a Canadian responsible person, it is asked upon your responsible person when they're doing their overall safety assessment. I don't know specifically if Health Canada goes into each individual product and checks the IFRA. I do know when they're doing their when Health Canada is doing their review, this definitely fragrance is going to be hugely highlighted in the next year. I do know that for a fact, and it's already been highlighted for the last 2 years. So if you have a fragrance or flavor, this is definitely going to be on the regulatory scope, and anyone who you're working with for Health Canada compliance should be looking at this for you ahead of time as well. But again, it is a globally accepted body, so you should be trying to comply with this, because I think that it's important as a brand, as a cosmetic person, to make sure the consumer is safe, right? These are safety guidelines. Okay. A couple of questions. Let me get through some of these. Let's see. Is IFRA biased towards synthetic substances? Actually, no. I'm going to say no. I definitely think there is a huge across the board. As I mentioned, I think that the synthetic substances have had a bad rap for the last, I would say, 10 years. I definitely think they look more into the synthetic substances because of the potential of irritation or potentially something that can cause potential health exposure to something that could be a health risk. But I don't think they're necessarily biased towards it. I think it's just when you're developing new synthetic products, right? There's sometimes not everything about it, right? I'm sure at this point everyone knows everything about certain natural substances, but as we just saw, right, with this new standard set, we didn't know everything about natural complex substances, and they're starting to see that they need to also be limited and regulated in a better way. I will tell you, there's some natural flavors that I see and I get an IFRA statement, and IFRA is 100%, you can use that flavor 100% in every category. And I'm always thinking to myself, are you sure? Like that's pretty crazy, 100% in any type of formulation. So I think it's not that there was, more restrictions around synthetics. I think natural just had the, it's better for you without really understanding the complexities around synthetic versus natural. Again, there is a lot of differences, I think, with the where IFRA has been and where it has come. And I think we're going to see a lot more natural substances come under review. And again, I think there's definitely a nice mix. Between using a natural flavor versus a synthetic flavor, formula wise too, right? Stability and durability. I will be a synthetic lady probably for the rest of my career. Love the whole natural turn. Love, that we're trying to get back into natural things, but there's a lot to be said about existing synthetic materials, existing synthetic fragrances that definitely can be better or potentially cause less irritations or issues or health risks when used properly. And then that's where I think this safety assessment from IFRA and the expert panel comes into such huge play, right? We don't want to throw out synthetic fragrances completely. We want to keep them as a good, plan to have, but it definitely needs a better safety assessment. And a more deeper understanding of what we mentioned, right? The traces in it, and how they're handling the traces to that final product. So a lot of questions about categories, and again, all the category, like I see a question on what, baby care. I see one for aftercare. I see a couple other ones. All the categories can be found on the IFRA website. I don't have them all memorized. I apologize, but they are all on the IFRA website. And you can definitely take a look at those. More importantly, make sure you take a look at the categories that have changed. That's been the biggest one that I've seen people kind of, freak out about a little bit more, is the ones that are already changed. Couple more questions. If a product does not comply with IFRA limits, can it not be placed on the market? Or are there cases where the products are already on the market and there's no reported adverse events? Could they be still kept on the market? So really great question. So that's where that timeline came in the beginning of the presentation, where this new standard, went into effect for new creations, new fragrance mixtures, new products at a specific timeline, and then for existing, right, had the 28 months. If something is already sitting on a shelf somewhere, something is already, out there in the world and has been since before this implication, there's no way for you to take it off the market, and nor do you need to. What this really puts in place is if you have new products, right, and then existing ones that you need to reformulate, I would not recommend keeping it on the market. I know no adverse events and there's no issues, but those standards being updated and the timeline that they had provided help brands, right, the time to comply. So definitely don't recommend not complying. We could definitely take a look and see, our team can see, how to help you through. And yeah, I think we have time for one more question. In terms of a lot of questions, okay, there's a lot of questions on natural again. Again, if you go through the new standards or if you want us to help you, we will definitely take that on and help you. The natural complex substances, right, are what I had mentioned, the basil and the tarragon and the nutmeg. There is going to be more review of more natural substances. I don't know what that looks like, don't know timing, but they're definitely all encompassed in there. If you're having trouble understanding them, definitely reach out to John and we can get you to the right person, the right safety assessor to review those for you. Again, it's embodying what the fragrance community and industry are seeing. So it's really, really important to understand that these updates, especially, they're not meant to be, to ruin a product or to change a product. They're really meant for the safety of the consumer, the end user, right? So I wish I had more on that, but that's kind of all I got. And then a lot of questions on unfragranced. Again, reach out to us. We can set you up with one of our safety assessors. You know, anything that, again, that is an essential oil ingredient or anything that is fragrant, has some type of odor, some type of smell, potentially has that implication of IFRA. And I think it is really important, if you're not an expert in this, to reach out to the experts to help you get through this maybe, you know, I don't want to say gray area, but an area that you might not be 100%, you know, an expert in. I want to thank everyone for joining us. I hope we learned a lot about IFRA, a lot about fragrances. Again, reach out with any questions. We are more than happy to help. I see a lot of questions on IFRA limits, so we are happy to help. Reach out. Deadline is tomorrow, but we still can help you move to a compliant formula with IFRA. Thank you, everyone.